The stench hit you first. Even before you entered the Sun King's bedchamber at Versailles, that nauseating smell of rotting flesh mingled with expensive perfumes and burning incense would assault your senses. It was August 1715, and Louis XIV, the most powerful monarch in Europe, the man who had declared "L'état, c'est moi," I am the state, was dying in the most horrific way imaginable. Picture this. A king who had ruled for 72 years, longer than any European monarch in history, reduced to a writhing mass of agony on silk sheets that had to be changed multiple times per day because of the putrid discharge from his gangrenous leg. The man who had built Versailles, conquered nations, and made France the envy of Europe was now begging his doctors to end his suffering. His leg had turned black, the gangrene spreading like wildfire up toward his thigh, and every breath was a struggle against waves of excruciating pain. This is not how gods are supposed to die. But Louis XIV, the Sun King, was discovering that even divine right could not protect him from the most human of fates. A slow, agonizing death that would strip away every pretense of royal dignity and leave him as vulnerable as the poorest peasant in his kingdom. What follows is the true story of those final, terrifying weeks in the summer of 1715, when the most absolute monarch in European history faced the one absolute he could not control: his own mortality. It is a tale of medical ignorance, royal denial, and the ultimate equality that death brings to all men, regardless of their earthly power. The hunting party returned to Versailles on August 10, 1715, just as the sun was setting over the magnificent gardens that Louis XIV had spent decades perfecting. The king, now 76 years old, dismounted from his horse with a slight grimace, unusual for a man who had prided himself on his physical prowess and had continued hunting well into his 70s. His courtiers noticed the momentary hesitation, the way he favored his left leg, but none dared comment. To acknowledge the king's physical weakness would be to acknowledge something far more dangerous: that the Sun King might be mortal after all. Louis XIV had always been a man of remarkable constitution. Throughout his long reign, he had survived smallpox, typhoid fever, and numerous other ailments that would have killed lesser men. He had undergone a famous anal fistula operation in 1686 that had been performed without anesthesia, and he had endured it with such stoic dignity that his surgeon became a celebrity and the operation was celebrated as a triumph of French medicine. The king's ability to suffer in silence had become part of his mystique, proof of his divine nature. But this pain in his leg was different. It began as a dull ache, the sort of discomfort that might be expected from a man of his age after a long day in the saddle. The king's personal physician, Guy Crescent Fagan, examined the leg and found what appeared to be a small dark spot on the skin, just above the ankle. It looked like a bruise, perhaps from a riding boot that had rubbed too vigorously. Fagan prescribed rest and warm compresses, confident that the king's legendary resilience would see him through this minor affliction. The routine at Versailles continued as if nothing had changed. The lever, the elaborate morning ritual of dressing the king, proceeded with its usual pomp and ceremony. Dozens of nobles competed for the honor of handing Louis his shirt or holding his mirror, each gesture choreographed according to strict protocol that had been refined over decades. The king's day was a carefully orchestrated performance, every moment from waking to sleeping designed to reinforce his image as the center of the universe around which all of France revolved. But those closest to the king began to notice subtle changes. His step was less sure, his famous posture, perfected through years of dancing lessons, began to show signs of strain. During the afternoon council meetings, he would occasionally shift uncomfortably in his chair, and once or twice he was seen to wince when he thought no one was looking. The courtiers, trained to read every nuance of their monarch's behavior, began to whisper among themselves. Something was wrong with the Sun King. By August 15th, the pain had intensified. The dark spot on Louis's leg had begun to spread, and the surrounding skin had taken on an angry red color. Dr. Fagan, now deeply concerned, consulted with his colleagues. They applied the standard treatments of the time: bloodletting, purging, and the application of various poultices made from herbs and animal parts. They reasoned that the king's condition was caused by an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that restoring this balance would cure the ailment. The king submitted to these treatments with his characteristic stoicism, but privately he was beginning to worry. In his long life, he had faced many challenges: wars, rebellions, family tragedies, but he had always been able to rely on his physical strength. Now, for the first time, his body was betraying him. The pain kept him awake at night, and during the day he found it increasingly difficult to maintain the royal composure that had defined his reign. Meanwhile, the business of governing continued. Foreign ambassadors were received. Dispatches from the various battlefields of Europe were read and answered, and the endless petitions from nobles and commoners alike were processed. But there was a growing sense of unease in the palace. The king's illness was still being kept secret from the general public, but within the walls of Versailles, everyone knew that something was terribly wrong. The irony was not lost on those who understood the gravity of the situation. Louis XIV had spent his entire reign creating an image of himself as the Sun King, the source of all light and life in France. He had built Versailles as a monument to his own glory, a place where he could be worshipped like a god. Now, in the very palace that was meant to celebrate his immortality, he was facing the most mortal of human experiences: the slow, inexorable approach of death. By August 20th, the pretense that this was merely a minor ailment had become impossible to maintain. The dark spot on Louis XIV's leg had expanded into a patch of blackened flesh the size of a man's palm, and the smell, oh, the smell, had become a constant presence in the king's chambers. The servants who attended to him tried to mask it with perfumes and incense, but the sickly sweet odor of rotting flesh permeated everything. Dr. Fagan was now openly alarmed. He had summoned the most renowned physicians in France to consult on the king's condition, but their collective wisdom seemed powerless against this mysterious ailment. They diagnosed it as gangrene, a term that struck fear into the hearts of all who heard it. In an age before antibiotics, gangrene was essentially a death sentence. The only treatment was amputation, and even that offered no guarantee of survival. The thought of amputating the king's leg was almost unthinkable. This was not just any patient. This was Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose perfect body was supposed to be a reflection of his divine right to rule. How could they propose to mutilate the sacred person of the monarch? And yet, as the gangrene spread up his leg like a dark tide, it became clear that drastic action might be necessary. The king himself seemed to understand the gravity of his situation. He had always been a man of keen intelligence, and despite the medieval nature of medical knowledge at the time, he could see what was happening to his body. The leg was dying, and if something wasn't done soon, he would die with it. But the idea of facing his subjects, his people who saw him as a godlike figure, as an amputee, was almost as terrifying as the prospect of death itself. The palace tried to maintain normalcy, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. The king's daily routines were disrupted by his condition. He could no longer stand for extended periods, which made the elaborate court ceremonies awkward and uncomfortable. His famous appetite, Louis XIV had been a legendary gourmand, began to wane as the pain and infection took their toll on his system. Even his legendary sexual prowess, which had been the subject of court gossip for decades, was now just a memory. Dr. Fagan and his colleagues tried everything they knew. They applied leeches to draw out the bad blood. They administered powerful purgatives to cleanse the king's system, and they even attempted to burn away the infected tissue with hot irons. Each treatment seemed to make the situation worse, and the king's suffering intensified with each passing day. The psychological toll was perhaps even worse than the physical pain. Louis XIV had built his entire identity around his image as the Sun King, powerful, eternal, divine. Now he was confronting the reality that he was just a man, subject to the same frailties and mortality as his humblest subjects. The king who had once declared that he was the state was now reduced to a helpless patient, dependent on the mercy of doctors who seemed as baffled by his condition as he was. The courtiers who had spent their lives competing for the king's favor now found themselves in the uncomfortable position of witnessing his decline. Some, loyal to the end, remained at his side, offering what comfort they could. Others, more practical in their outlook, began to position themselves for the inevitable transition of power. The king's heir, his great-grandson who would become Louis XV, was only 5 years old, which meant that a regency would be necessary. The political implications of the king's illness were as complex as the medical ones. Perhaps most difficult of all was the king's relationship with his own mortality. For more than 7 decades, he had lived as if death was something that happened to other people. He had outlived his son, his grandson, and many of his closest advisors. He had survived wars, plagues, and political upheavals. In his mind, he had become something more than human, a force of nature as permanent as the sun that gave him his nickname. Now, as the gangrene spread and the pain intensified, he was forced to confront the truth that he had spent his entire life denying. He was mortal, and his time was running out. The Sun King was setting, and nothing in his vast power could stop it. The third week of August brought no relief, only escalating horror. The gangrene had now consumed nearly half of Louis XIV's left leg, turning the flesh a mottled black and green that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. The pain was so intense that even the king's legendary stoicism began to crack. Those who were present during his private moments reported that he would sometimes cry out in agony, his face contorted in expressions of suffering that seemed almost inhuman. Dr. Fagan had called in every expert he could find, but their collective ignorance was becoming increasingly apparent. They tried bleeding the king with specially crafted silver instruments, reasoning that base metals might be contributing to his condition. They applied poultices made from everything from ground pearls to unicorn horn, substances that cost more than most people would see in a lifetime but proved utterly useless against the relentless advance of the infection. The smell had become so overwhelming that the king's chambers had to be constantly fumigated with burning herbs and perfumes. Servants would hold scented cloths to their faces when they entered the room, and even the most hardened courtiers found themselves struggling not to retch. The man who had created the most beautiful palace in Europe was now confined to rooms that smelled like a charnel house. What made the situation even more unbearable was the king's awareness of what was happening to him. His mind remained sharp even as his body deteriorated, and he could see the fear and revulsion in the eyes of those around him. The courtiers who had once competed for his attention now found excuses to avoid his presence. The king who had been the center of the universe at Versailles was becoming increasingly isolated, surrounded by the stench of his own decay. The psychological torture was perhaps worse than the physical pain. Louis XIV had spent his entire life carefully constructing an image of himself as a divine ruler, infallible and eternal. Every aspect of his daily routine, from the morning lever to the evening coucher, had been designed to reinforce this mythology. Now, as he lay writhing in agony, that carefully crafted image was crumbling before his eyes. The king began to speak of his regrets. In his more lucid moments, he would confess to those closest to him that he had been too fond of war, that he had spent too much money on his palaces while his people suffered. These admissions were shocking to those who heard them. The Sun King had never admitted to any fault or weakness. But now, facing death, he seemed to be seeking some kind of absolution for a lifetime of absolute power. The medical treatments became increasingly desperate and barbaric. The doctors, faced with their own professional failure, began to try ever more extreme remedies. They applied red-hot irons to the king's leg, attempting to burn away the infected tissue. They forced him to drink concoctions made from the blood of various animals, believing that this might restore the balance of his humors. They even attempted a primitive form of surgery, cutting away pieces of dead flesh without any form of anesthesia. Each treatment seemed to make the king's suffering worse. His screams could be heard throughout the palace, despite the thick walls and heavy tapestries that were meant to muffle sound. The servants who attended to him were traumatized by what they witnessed, and several had to be replaced because they could no longer bear to enter the king's chambers. The political implications of the king's condition were becoming increasingly urgent. France was still technically at war with several European powers, and the king's illness was being kept secret for fear that it might encourage enemy action. But within the palace, everyone knew that succession planning was becoming critical. The king's heir was a 5-year-old child, and the question of who would serve as regent was becoming a matter of life and death for the kingdom. Through it all, Louis XIV maintained what dignity he could. Even in his worst moments, he would attempt to receive important visitors and handle the most critical affairs of state. But his famous composure was cracking. The man who had never shown weakness in front of his subjects was now reduced to a suffering animal, and the transformation was almost too horrible to witness. The king's relationship with God, which had always been complex, became increasingly fraught. He had always seen himself as ruling by divine right, chosen by God to lead France. Now he was forced to confront the possibility that God might be calling him home. He began to pray more frequently, sometimes crying out for divine intervention even as he endured the medieval tortures that passed for medical treatment. As August drew to a close, it became clear that the king's condition was terminal. The gangrene had spread too far, and the primitive medical knowledge of the time was powerless to stop it. The Sun King was dying, and his death would be as agonizing as his life had been glorious. As September approached, the reality of the king's impending death could no longer be denied. The gangrene had spread to his thigh, and the infection was clearly winning its battle against Louis XIV's once mighty constitution. Dr. Fagan, his face gaunt from weeks of sleepless nights and professional failure, finally admitted to the king what everyone already knew. There was nothing more that medical science could do. The king received this news with a mixture of relief and terror. Relief because the endless, futile treatments could finally stop. The bloodletting, the burning, the poisonous concoctions that had only added to his suffering. Terror because he now had to face the one enemy he had never been able to defeat: his own mortality. The Sun King, who had spent his entire reign defying limits and conquering obstacles, was about to meet the ultimate limitation. With characteristic decisiveness, Louis XIV began to prepare for his death with the same meticulous attention to detail that he had brought to every aspect of his life. If he was going to die, he would do so as a king, with dignity and ceremony befitting his station. He called for his confessor, Cardinal de Rohan, and began the process of spiritual preparation that would occupy his final days. The confession itself was a marathon session that lasted several hours. The king, propped up in his bed by silk pillows that were frequently changed due to the constant drainage from his wound, recounted the sins of a lifetime. He spoke of his pride, his vanity, his love of war, and his neglect of his people's welfare. He confessed to his numerous infidelities, his harsh treatment of religious minorities, and his excessive spending on personal luxuries while his subjects starved. Perhaps most significantly, he expressed regret for his treatment of the Huguenots, the French Protestants whom he had persecuted relentlessly throughout his reign. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 had driven hundreds of thousands of skilled craftsmen and merchants from France, weakening the kingdom's economy and causing immense human suffering. Now, facing divine judgment, Louis XIV seemed to understand the magnitude of his error. The king also began the process of saying goodbye to his family and closest advisors. These scenes were heartrending, as the man who had been the center of their universe was clearly slipping away. His great-grandson, the future Louis XV, was brought to his bedside for a final meeting. The 5-year-old boy, barely comprehending what was happening, was given advice that would echo through the ages. Do not imitate me in my taste for war or for spending. Try to relieve your people, which I have been unhappy enough not to do. The irony of this deathbed wisdom was not lost on those who witnessed it. The Sun King, who had spent his entire reign glorifying war and building monuments to his own ego, was now urging his successor to do the opposite. It was as if the approach of death had given him a clarity that had been absent throughout his life. The process of receiving the last rites was elaborate and deeply moving. The Cardinal de Rohan, himself visibly shaken by the king's condition, administered the sacraments with trembling hands. The king, despite his pain, responded to the Latin prayers with perfect pronunciation and deep devotion. Even in his final agony, he remained the consummate performer, playing his role as the Christian king with the same skill he had brought to every other aspect of his public life. The palace chaplains took turns maintaining a constant vigil, praying for the king's soul and offering what comfort they could. The king's chambers, which had once been filled with the laughter and conversation of courtiers seeking favor, now echoed with the somber tones of religious services. The transformation was complete. The center of worldly power had become a place of spiritual preparation. Meanwhile, the practical business of succession had to be addressed. The king's will, which had been carefully prepared over many years, was brought out and reviewed. The provisions for the regency were confirmed, and the various officials who would govern France during the minority of Louis XV were given their final instructions. Even in his extremity, the king maintained his concern for the smooth functioning of the state. The courtiers who had built their lives around the king's favor now faced an uncertain future. Some, genuinely devoted to their monarch, remained at his side regardless of the personal cost. Others, more practical in their outlook, began to position themselves for the new regime. The palace, which had always been a hive of political intrigue, buzzed with whispered conversations about the future. As the king's strength ebbed, his moments of lucidity became increasingly rare and precious. When he was conscious and able to speak, he would often express amazement at the intensity of his suffering. "I had no idea," he would whisper to his attendants, "that dying would be so difficult." The man who had lived his entire life insulated from the hardships of ordinary existence was finally experiencing the common human lot. Dr. Fagin, who had barely left the king's side for days, could only watch helplessly as his royal patient slipped away. The physician who had once been so confident in his abilities was now a broken man, his reputation destroyed by his inability to save the most important patient in France. He would occasionally check the king's pulse or listen to his breathing, but these were empty gestures. There was nothing more that medical science could do. The king's family and closest advisors had gathered in the antechamber, maintaining a death watch that was as much about political necessity as personal devotion. The transition of power from Louis XIV to his 5-year-old great-grandson had to be managed carefully, and the presence of the court's leading figures was essential to ensure legitimacy. But the political calculations could not entirely mask the human drama that was unfolding. Throughout the early hours of the morning, the king drifted in and out of consciousness. When he was aware, he would sometimes whisper prayers or try to speak to those around him. His voice, once commanding and resonant, was now barely audible. Those who leaned close to hear him reported that he spoke mostly about his regrets, The wars he had fought, the money he had spent, the suffering he had caused. Around 7 a.m., the king seemed to rally slightly. His eyes opened, and for a moment, some of his old clarity returned. He asked for Cardinal de Rohan to be summoned, and when the confessor arrived, the king made one final confession. The details of this last spiritual reckoning were kept secret, but those who witnessed it reported that the king seemed to find some peace in the ritual. The cardinal then administered the last rites for the final time. The king responded to the Latin prayers with what strength he had left, his lips moving almost imperceptibly as he repeated the familiar words. It was a scene that would have been impossible to imagine at the height of his power. The Sun King, reduced to a whisper, preparing his soul for divine judgment. As the morning progressed, the king's breathing became increasingly irregular. He would take several rapid, shallow breaths, then pause for long moments that made everyone in the room hold their breath in anticipation. His pulse was weak and erratic, and his skin had taken on the waxy pallor that those experienced in death recognized as the final sign. The courtiers who had been summoned to witness the king's final moments filled the chambers and adjoining rooms. These men and women had built their lives around the royal presence, and now they were watching that presence fade away. Some wept openly, others maintained the stoic composure that court protocol demanded. All understood that they were witnessing the end of an era. At approximately 8:15 a.m., the king's breathing became even more labored. Those closest to him could see that each breath was a struggle, and the pauses between breaths were becoming longer. Dr. Fagin, his hand on the king's wrist, felt the pulse growing weaker and more irregular. The end was approaching rapidly. The king's eyes, which had been closed for most of the morning, suddenly opened. For a moment, he seemed to see something that the others could not. His gaze was fixed on a point beyond the ceiling, and his face showed an expression of wonder or perhaps fear. His lips moved, and those who were close enough thought they heard him whisper a prayer. "Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." Then, with a final, barely audible sigh, Louis XIV stopped breathing. The Sun King was dead. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. After weeks of the king's labored breathing, the sudden absence of sound was almost shocking. Dr. Fagin, his hand still on the king's wrist, waited for several minutes before officially pronouncing what everyone already knew. The king was dead. The longest reign in European history had come to an end. The political machinery of the monarchy immediately swung into action. Cardinal de Rohan stepped forward and formally announced the king's death to the assembled courtiers. The phrase "Le roi est mort, vive le roi," "the king is dead, long live the king," was proclaimed, acknowledging the seamless transition of power to the 5-year-old Louis XV. But the words seemed hollow in the face of the human tragedy that had just concluded. The king's body, which had been the focus of so much attention and care, was now just a corpse. The gangrene that had killed him continued its work even in death, and the smell of decay seemed to intensify. The servants who had attended to him during his final illness now had to prepare his body for the elaborate funeral rituals that would follow. The Sun King had set, and the darkness that followed seemed to envelop not just Versailles but all of France. The man who had been the center of the kingdom's universe was gone, and in his place was a child who could barely understand what had happened. The age of absolute monarchy that Louis XIV had perfected was ending, and the future was uncertain. As the news of the king's death spread throughout the palace and beyond, the reactions were mixed. Some mourned the passing of a great monarch. Others saw it as the end of an era of oppression and excess. But all understood that something fundamental had changed. The Sun King's reign was over, and France would never be the same. The embalmers who were summoned to prepare the royal corpse were shocked by what they found. The infection had progressed so far that entire sections of the king's body were in an advanced state of decomposition. The left leg, which had been the source of so much agony, was now completely black and putrid. The smell was so overwhelming that the embalmers had to work in shifts, frequently leaving the chamber to breathe fresh air. The autopsy, conducted by the royal physicians as a matter of protocol, revealed the full extent of the damage. The gangrene had spread throughout the king's system, affecting not just his leg but his internal organs as well. The doctors found evidence of widespread infection, and they marveled that the king had survived as long as he had. The autopsy report, carefully worded to avoid any suggestion of medical incompetence, nevertheless made clear that the king had died in agony. The process of preparing the body for lying in state was a nightmare for those involved. The traditional methods of embalming were inadequate to deal with the extent of the decomposition, and the embalmers had to resort to increasingly desperate measures to make the corpse presentable. They used massive quantities of perfumes, spices, and preservatives, but nothing could completely mask the smell of decay. The king's body was eventually placed in the Mercury Room at Versailles, where it would lie in state for 8 days according to tradition. The room was heavily perfumed and decorated with elaborate hangings, but those who came to pay their respects were still assaulted by the underlying odor of decomposition. The irony was inescapable. The Sun King, who had created the most beautiful palace in Europe, was now the source of its most repulsive stench. The courtiers who had to maintain the death vigil found it almost unbearable. They were required by protocol to remain in the presence of the corpse, but many found excuses to leave the room as frequently as possible. Some became physically ill from the smell, others were psychologically traumatized by the sight of their once mighty king reduced to a rotting corpse. The experience would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. The political implications of the king's death were immediately apparent. The 5-year-old Louis XV was proclaimed king, but the real power would rest with the Regency Council that had been established to govern during his minority. The Duke of Orleans, the dead king's nephew, assumed the role of regent, but his authority was far from secure. The palace was already buzzing with intrigue as various factions maneuvered for position in the new order. The news of the king's death spread throughout France and Europe with varying reactions. In France, the response was mixed. Some mourned the passing of the great monarch. Others saw it as liberation from decades of oppression and excessive taxation. The common people, who had borne the burden of the king's wars and extravagances, were more interested in what the new reign might bring than in lamenting the old one. Among the European powers, the reaction was more calculating. The death of Louis XIV removed one of the most formidable figures from the political landscape, and other monarchs began to consider how they might take advantage of France's temporary weakness. The Holy Roman Emperor, the King of England, and the other great powers of Europe all understood that the transition from the Sun King to a child ruler represented an opportunity. The funeral preparations became a source of additional horror. The traditional ceremony required the king's body to be transported from Versailles to the royal necropolis at St. Denis, a journey that would take several hours. The problem was that the state of decomposition made this transport extremely difficult. Special precautions had to be taken to prevent the corpse from literally falling apart during the journey. The funeral cortege that finally left Versailles on September 9, 1715, was a surreal spectacle. The elaborate hearse, drawn by 8 black horses and accompanied by hundreds of mourners, carried a corpse that was barely holding together. The embalmers had done their best, but the underlying reality of decay could not be completely disguised. The smell was so powerful that it could be detected by spectators standing considerable distances from the procession. The irony of the situation was not lost on contemporary observers. The Sun King, who had spent his entire reign creating elaborate ceremonies to celebrate his power and glory, was now the subject of a ceremony that emphasized the most basic human reality: that all flesh is mortal. The man who had tried to transcend human limitations was being reduced to his most fundamental components. The burial itself at St. Denis was mercifully brief. The king's remains were placed in the royal tomb alongside his predecessors, but those who were present reported that the ceremony was rushed due to the condition of the corpse. The priests who conducted the final rites did so with obvious discomfort, and the mourners who were required to kiss the king's hand as part of the traditional ceremony found the experience almost unbearable. The psychological impact of the king's death on those who had witnessed his final agony was profound and lasting. The courtiers who had spent their lives in the rarefied atmosphere of Versailles had been forced to confront the most basic realities of human existence. They had watched their god-king reduced to a suffering animal, and the experience had shattered many of their fundamental assumptions about power and mortality. Dr. Fagan, the royal physician whose failure to save the king had destroyed his reputation, became a broken man. He would spend the remaining years of his life in obscurity, haunted by the memory of the Sun King's final agony. His medical colleagues, who had been equally helpless in the face of the king's condition, found their own reputations severely damaged. The failure of the medical establishment to save the most important patient in France had exposed the primitive nature of contemporary medicine. The servants who had attended to the king during his final illness were also deeply affected. Many had to be replaced because they could not bear to continue working in the palace where they had witnessed such horror. Those who remained were often troubled by nightmares and other psychological symptoms that would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The impact on the royal family was equally severe. The future Louis XV, though only 5 years old, was deeply affected by the trauma of his great-grandfather's death. The other members of the royal family, who had been forced to witness the king's degradation, would carry the memory of his final agony for the rest of their lives. The experience had shown them that even kings were mortal, and that divine right offered no protection against the inevitability of death. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, share and comment below. See you in the next one.